Hello, my name is William Forrest Flammer, and I'm an undergraduate history major at Mercer University. My research focused on the opinions of German Americans concerning the unification of Germany in 1871 and on the Kulturkampf in 1873. To talk about this particular immigrant group and their experience, I need to go over some background information to put my research in contemporary context. The definition of who is and who is not a citizen has plagued many nations over the course of human history. The modern definition of citizen of the United States is simply anyone who meets the legal requirements and who has earned it through the channels of the federal government. However, American society has not always accepted this legalistic definition of citizen. Citizenship during the 18th and 19th centuries was largely reserved for whites. By 1850, a white person was Anglo-Saxon in descent and typically Protestant. Asians, Africans, Slavs, Italians, Irish, and Germans were all largely excluded from this definition. Germans were typically excluded due to their religious beliefs. Protestant Germans were more accepted than their Catholic counterparts, whose loyalty was considered questionable due to the papal stance concerning liberal governments like the United States and the German Empire. However, German culture was seen as barbaric. Many Protestant Germans were typically too liberal for American standards, and Germans were stalwartly against measures to limit the consumption of alcohol. In 1848, a democratic revolution rocked Germany. Revolutionaries and reformers led by liberals and the new Frankfurt Parliament created a constitution for united Germany, one made up of the German lands along the Rhine, including Alsace-Lotharingen, the German portions of Austria, and the German portions of Prussia. They excluded territories held by German kingdoms or states that had high populations of non-Germans, hence the exclusion of Switzerland and non-German Austria and Prussia. While the revolution would be defeated by conservative forces within 2 years, the borders set down by the Frankfurt Parliament stuck within the mind of the German people. The defeat led to many of those who participated in the revolution to leave Germany. Many traveled to the United States, where they would quickly become part of the German American elite. These elite intellectuals would open newspapers, lead political movements, and represent German communities to their neighbors. The 48ers were also highly productive in terms of surviving primary sources, and as a result, they are typically overrepresented in the German American population. In an attempt to correct this, I made a point during my research to search for more typical or average Germans, as opposed to this educated upper class. Anglo-Americans can be divided into three groups: Protestants, Catholics, and nativists. These classifications are obviously simplifications, but an understanding of Anglo-American opinions based off of these classifications is useful for placing my research in the American context. Protestants were generally anti-Catholic and held progressive politics. They fell into either the Republican or Democratic parties, depending on their region and immediate interests. Catholics were socially conservative, but in the case of Anglo-Americans, were religiously liberal. In the decades following the Kulturkampf in Germany, the papacy would be forced to respond to a liberal heresy that had appeared in the American Catholic Church, called Americanists. Americanists desired to compromise between the doctrine of papal infallibility and liberal political policies. Our last camp, the nativists, were constituted by the most conservative and anti-Catholic elements of the American population. And antebellum South, nativist forces would have easily been mistaken for members of the KKK or other similar organizations. Their goal was to ensure the dominance of Anglo-Americans and to prevent the fall of the country to Catholicism. To this end, nativists would later support the Prohibition movement, as they saw it as a strike against the drunken Irish and Germans. And finally, we have the Kulturkampf. The Kulturkampf was the brainchild of Otto von Bismarck, Chancellor of the German Empire. He was deeply concerned over the political stances taken by the pontiff and wanted to prevent divisions within the German population from weakening the state. In simple terms, he did not trust the Catholic Germans to choose Germany over the word of the Pope. As a result, the state of Prussia and a few others took various measures to limit the rights and reach of Catholics in government, education, and society. They banned the Jesuit order and its allies from the empire, and by 1875, over half of the bishops in Germany were under arrest or forced to leave their assigned territories. Many of these measures were couched in progressive terms or values, such as secularizing the state and preventing the indoctrination of children. As a result of the context I have presented to you, in both the United States and Germany, there were many who questioned whether someone could be a good Catholic while also being a loyal citizen. According to the nativists, many Protestants and German liberals, they simply could not. This question also became tied to Germans as a greater whole in the United States. If being American was meeting the cultural values of an Anglo-American, how could the German American become American enough for them? For most German Americans, this question had a fairly simple answer. In the 19th century, they could be an American without becoming Anglo. And so, German Americans over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries developed their own communities, schools, media, and entertainment. German media prior to unification tried to satisfy specific audiences, mostly based on their region of origin, political beliefs, or trade. With unification, newsprint could present news from Germany within a much broader German context. News from Baden could be made relevant to people from Pomerania. Divisions of opinion, of course, remained. To better understand this, I studied several newspapers and focused on their coverage of two notable events, the unification of Germany and the Kulturkampf. What I found was that their opinions largely depended on their political beliefs when it concerned the unification, and almost wholly depended on their religious beliefs when it came to the Kulturkampf. When considering unification, the vast majority of German Americans appeared to be favorable towards the empire. This included the 48ers, who had attempted to construct a government very similar in appearance 2 decades before, and were pleased to see this new German state follow the borders that they set down during the revolution. Those who were not ecstatic over its formation were typically concerned over a specific issue. The issue might be the treatment of their home region by the Prussians, or in one instance, a liberal paper feared the new government was far too loyal to the conservative forces of Germany, such as the emperor and the landholding nobility. To this extent, they were far more concerned with the fate of the French Parliament after the Franco-Prussian War and the formation of the German Reichstag. German Americans were far more divided over the Kulturkampf, of course. Catholics were personally affronted by the turn of events. Some even believed that it was a sign that God was about to destroy the new German state. Oddly, both conservatives and 48ers were against the Kulturkampf as well. Conservatives believed it upset the natural order of Germany too much to have such a program, and the 48ers believed that all Catholics that are German citizens should have the right, as a citizen, to practice whatever belief they wish. Protestant Germans, either Lutherans or those who had converted to American evangelical forms of faith, were much more favorable towards the Kulturkampf, mostly because they believed Catholics were an incorrect form of faith and that they were too loyal to the Vatican. Anglo and German American relations were never particularly high. The poor relations mostly stemmed from a combination of a language barrier, the average German political allegiance to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and due to German cultural expressions such as beer gardens, German language churches, and media. These tensions resulted in violence at times, such as the Bloody Monday riot in Louisville, Kentucky. First-hand account of that day stated that the writer watched how the nativists ran through the streets, like the screaming seven, to see the human blood. His advice to his family as a result was to stay where you were born, that is your home. Even if there's nothing besides bread and potatoes and salt, that is still better than meat 3 times a day in a foreign country. Besides violence, anti-German sentiment continued to rise through the early years of the 20th century. When the United States entered the Great War, many German communities were forced to close their newspapers and to stop teaching German in their schools. Both nativists and Germans felt like the implementation of prohibition nationwide was a designed attack on German and Irish culture, which should come as no surprise considering the various outbreaks of violence over closing taverns on Sundays, such as the Lager Beer riot in Chicago, 1855. Besides the study on German American papers, I also studied the letters that individuals sent to their family back in Germany. These letters mostly came from farmers in the Midwest, but their opinions concerning events across the ocean will hopefully strike you as much as they did me. Christian Lentz believed that, should the mighty Napoleon and France be delivered to the Germans, if Germany wins, that will also be a victory for all Germans wherever they are in the whole world. Franz Joseph Lowen, in one letter, reminisced about his homeland, saying, "Although I have been in America for 23 years, I still like to think now and then about the dear homeland where my cradle stood and where I spent a happy childhood, despite many a hardship. Lowen had several concerns about the new German state and the possible destruction of his birthplace, and he seemed justified when the Kulturkampf began. Germany may experience hard times again, for if the dear Lord begins his Kulturkampf, then what was written may come to pass. The Lord shall strike through the kings in the day of his wrath. He shall wound the heads over many countries. For a long time, the newspapers had nothing good to report from Germany. Thus, I would like to hear from you. I wish with all my heart that you are well, but even more do I hope that you all remain true to the Holy Catholic Church and stand firm in the fight against her enemies. It's possible that he saw Bismarck in much the same light as the community of St. Martin's Church did, who, when carving a relief of Jesus carrying the cross, they made one of the Roman soldiers such a chancellor. Johann Bauer, however, had a different complaint against Bismarck. It is a shame that we get so many of the Jesuits and barefoot monks you've driven out. They are viewed by Protestants with great anguish and suspicion and indignation. If the great and world-famous minister von Bismarck had locked them up for life on bread and water, we'd have thought much more highly of him. Obviously, Bauer would prefer Catholicism to not follow him to the United States. To wrap up my presentation and my research, I wanted to leave the viewer with some thoughts concerning the period and the study of immigrant history. Germans are now considered white in typical American discourse. However, I hope my research shows that even within the German community, German Americans were not really sure what it meant to be American any more than their Anglo counterparts. The questions surrounding the conflict between ultramontanism and progressivism truly divided the German American community on several fronts. In many cases, Anglo-Americans seemed to misunderstand the beliefs and political opinions of Germans due to a kind of lost in translation effect. There's one notable instance where 48ers in Louisville, prior to the 1855 Bloody Monday riots, were protesting and advocating for a political reform of the Constitution. They felt that the President of the United States was too akin to a monarchy to be allowed to remain in charge of a republic. In instances such as this, the opinions of 48ers were projected onto the entire German American community, who did not always agree with their very liberal beliefs. In any case, the story of German Americans mostly ends in 1918. With the choice to either Anglonize or become pariahs, most Germans chose the former. In the modern United States, less 1/6 of the total population are descended from German heritage, and a little less than 1 million people speak German as their first language at home. Thank you for watching my presentation on my research, German Americans during the Kulturkampf, the influence of German American affairs in the United States.